Hello, and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we explore a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is November 4th. On this day in 1979, it was just after 10 in the morning in Tehran, Iran, when a crowd of students gathered outside of the United States Embassy gate. They called themselves the Muslim student followers of the Imam's line, and they carried posters, chains, and flags. Within minutes, the protest turned into a siege. The embassy gates were forced open. Dozens of Americans were all taken hostage. What started as a student demonstration became a 444-day ordeal that defined an era and reshaped U.S.-Iran relations. Today, we're talking about the Iran hostage crisis. Let's get started. Now, before we get into the hostage crisis, we need to have a little context. 9 months earlier, Iran had overthrown its monarch, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, ending 2,500 years of monarchy and replacing it with Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini's Islamic Republic. For many Iranians, the U.S. was not a neutral observer to this upheaval. It was the country that had helped restore the Shah to power back in 1953 in a CIA-backed coup that toppled Iran's elected prime minister, and that memory still burned. So, when the Shah, who is now sick with cancer and in exile, was admitted to the U.S. for medical treatment in October 1979, many in Tehran saw it as proof that America might be planning to interfere again. Student leaders began to talk about a second revolution, this time against what they called U.S. imperialism. 2 days before the embassy takeover, one organizer warned that if they didn't act soon, Washington might once again shape Iran's future. On the morning of November 4th, hundreds of student militants pushed past the outer fence of the U.S. Embassy compound. They climbed over the walls, cut through gates, and overwhelmed the small Marine guard post inside. Embassy staff tried to barricade doors and destroy sensitive documents, but by the end of the morning, they were surrounded. 66 Americans were captured in those first hours. Within days, the students released some, but 52 would remain in captivity for the next 444 days. Inside Iran's revolutionary government, the fallout was immediate. Prime Minister Mehdi Bazargan, who had been trying to steer a moderate course, resigned within days, leaving hardliners closer to Khomeini in control. That resignation, reported by the Washington Post and preserved in State Department archives, marked a shift from political uncertainty to revolutionary consolidation. The students had changed the course of their own government as well as U.S.-Iran relations. Back in Washington, the crisis exploded across headlines. Within 2 weeks, the captors released 13 hostages, women and African American personnel, claiming revolutionary and religious reasons for the decision. Another hostage, Richard Queen, was freed the next summer due to severe illness. For the 52 who were still held, conditions were grim. Many were blindfolded for days, isolated in cells, or subjected to psychological pressure. President Jimmy Carter imposed sanctions immediately. On November 12, 1979, he banned Iranian oil imports. 2 days later, he froze nearly all Iranian assets in U.S. banks, orders now remembered as the first wide-scale use of financial sanctions as a foreign policy tool. Meanwhile, at the United Nations, the Security Council condemned the hostage-taking in resolutions 457 and 461, both adopted that December. Iran ignored them. As winter set in, the crisis turned into a nightly ritual in the United States. Every evening, network news counted the days of captivity. Day 50, day 100. ABC even built a new nightly program around it, America Held Hostage, which soon became Nightline. Ted Koppel's voice became the soundtrack to a national vigil. Families of the hostages formed support groups, praying for letters or proof of life. And as weeks turned into months, the standoff began to overshadow everything else, especially the 1980 presidential election. By spring of 1980, negotiations had stalled. The hostages were scattered in different safe houses across Tehran, making any rescue nearly impossible. Still, the Pentagon tried. In April, the U.S. launched Operation Eagle Claw, a secret mission to extract the hostages. 8 helicopters and a handful of C-130 transport planes were sent to a remote desert staging point codenamed Desert 1. But the mission fell apart almost immediately. Sandstorms, mechanical failures, and bad luck forced the team to abort. As the aircraft repositioned for withdrawal, one helicopter collided with a C-130 tanker, killing 8 U.S. servicemen. Their bodies were left behind with the wreckage. Photographs of the burned aircraft spread across Iranian media. The failed mission was a devastating blow to the Carter administration and to the military teams who had risked everything. The lessons from that night would later reshape U.S. special operations. Out of Eagle Claw's failure came the eventual creation of a unified special operations command, designed to prevent such tragedy from happening again. Throughout 1980, talks continued behind the scenes, mediated by Algeria. The breakthrough came with the Algiers Accords, which set terms for releasing the hostages in exchange for unfreezing around $8 billion in Iranian assets and resolving legal claims. On January 20th, minutes after Ronald Reagan took the oath of office, the 52 remaining hostages were released. The timing was both symbolic and deliberate. After 444 days, they were free, just as Carter's presidency ended. They were flown to Wiesbaden, West Germany, for medical evaluation and debriefing, then finally returned home to parades, tears, and reunions that dominated the front pages around the world. Meanwhile, 6 other Americans who had managed to evade capture by hiding with Canadian diplomats had already escaped the country in January 1980 through what became known as the Canadian Caper. That covert effort, later dramatized in the film Argo, was a rare bright spot in an otherwise painful saga. The Iran hostage crisis left deep scars on both nations. In the United States, it reshaped foreign policy. The economic tools that Carter used in 1979, the emergency declaration and asset freeze, became templates for modern sanctions that are still used today. It also hardened public attitudes toward Iran and ensured that more than 40 years later, the two countries still have no formal diplomatic relations. For the hostages themselves, the trauma didn't end in 1981. Many struggled with lasting psychological effects and financial hardship. In later decades, Congress passed legislation to compensate them and their families using penalties from companies that violated Iran sanctions. It was a belated act of recognition of what they had endured. November 4th, 1979 began with chants outside of an embassy gate. By nightfall, it had become a geopolitical rupture that lasted 444 days and shaped decades of mistrust. The faces on the news, the grainy hostage videos, and the Day 200 headlines became part of American memory, and the legacy of that crisis still lives on every time diplomacy falters. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If you found today's episode compelling, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. It'll help us grow. And be sure to join me again tomorrow as we explore another significant event in true crime history. Until then, stay safe and remember that behind every headline is a life worth remembering. Day by Day True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!